God said, "Your soulmate is finally ready to choose you. My beloved child, don't skip. Listen carefully, because this fictional story begins at the end of a long season of uncertainty. There are moments in life when two people care deeply for one another, yet fear, pride, timing, and unanswered questions keep them walking separate paths. Days become months, conversations become memories, and silence slowly begins to feel permanent. But beneath that silence, hearts continue growing in ways that cannot always be seen. This is not a prediction about your life or someone else's. It is a fictional story about faith, healing, personal growth, and the courage to choose love with honesty instead of fear. For what felt like forever, one person believed that letting go would be easier than facing their true emotions. They buried themselves in responsibilities, surrounded themselves with distractions, and convinced everyone, including themselves, that they had moved on. Yet every quiet evening brought familiar memories back. A favorite song reminded them of happier days. A familiar place stirred emotions they thought had disappeared. Every act of kindness they witnessed reminded them of someone who had once encouraged them to become a better person. No matter how hard they tried to silence those thoughts, they returned with greater clarity. Slowly they realized that avoiding the truth had not brought peace. It had only delayed healing. As another beautiful sunrise painted the horizon with brilliant shades of gold and blue, they stood quietly beneath the morning sky and whispered a simple prayer. They did not ask for every answer or for every obstacle to disappear. Instead, they asked for wisdom to choose what was right, courage to speak with honesty, and humility to accept whatever tomorrow might bring. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance did not arrive through dramatic signs or extraordinary miracles. It came through a quiet conviction growing stronger each day, a conviction that living truthfully is always better than living with endless regret. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story begins here. Meanwhile, the other person had also been changing in remarkable ways. During the months of silence, they had learned that genuine happiness cannot depend entirely upon another person's choices. They invested time in strengthening their character, caring for loved ones, serving others, and becoming someone who could build healthy relationships rooted in trust and mutual respect. Every disappointment became a lesson. Every challenge strengthened resilience. Every quiet season deepened compassion. Looking back, they realized that the waiting had never been meaningless. It had prepared both hearts to value honesty far more than comfort. One peaceful evening, while watching the sunset disappear beyond the distant hills, the person who had once been ruled by fear finally admitted something they could no longer deny. They no longer wanted to make decisions based on uncertainty. They no longer wanted pride to speak louder than kindness. They understood that true courage is not knowing exactly how everything will unfold. True courage is choosing integrity even when the future remains unknown. That realization lifted a burden they had carried for far too long. For the first time in many months, they felt genuine peace instead of constant anxiety. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. Sometimes what feels like God's guidance in a story is the gentle invitation to become the kind of person who chooses forgiveness instead of resentment, truth instead of avoidance, patience instead of impulsiveness, and hope instead of despair. Those quiet choices transform the heart long before they transform circumstances. The greatest miracle is often becoming someone capable of loving wisely, communicating honestly, and treating others with consistent compassion. As another sunrise filled the earth with warm golden light, they realized they were no longer waiting for someone else to change first. They themselves had changed. Fear no longer controlled their future. Pride no longer controlled their words. They had become someone ready to build relationships through sincerity, respect, and mutual understanding. Whatever happened next, they knew they would face it with grace rather than fear, because their heart had finally learned that lasting peace is found in living according to truth. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because they lead directly into the next unforgettable chapter of this fictional journey. The greatest decision in this story was never simply choosing another person. It was choosing courage over fear, forgiveness over resentment, and hope over despair. And as the morning light stretched across the horizon once again, two hearts, each transformed by patience, humility, and faith, were finally prepared to begin writing a new chapter built on honesty, compassion, and enduring love. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the choice that once seemed impossible was finally becoming clear. Listen carefully, because there comes a moment when fear loses its voice and truth quietly takes its place. For many months, one heart had stood between two roads. One path offered comfort through silence, while the other required courage through honesty. Every day they delayed the decision, the weight upon their heart became heavier. They finally realized that pretending not to care had never brought peace. It had only created distance between who they truly were and the person they wanted to become. As the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, they stood alone beneath a sky painted with soft shades of gold, blue, and crimson. The cool morning breeze carried a quiet stillness that invited reflection. They closed their eyes and remembered every lesson the long season of waiting had taught them. They remembered how disappointment had strengthened their resilience, how silence had taught them patience, and how every unanswered question had encouraged them to grow in wisdom rather than frustration. In this fictional story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not a promise that every circumstance would unfold exactly as expected. It was the gentle encouragement to act with integrity, compassion, and hope regardless of the outcome. Throughout the day, ordinary moments seemed to carry extraordinary meaning. They watched a father patiently teaching his child to ride a bicycle, smiling every time the child stood up after falling. They noticed an elderly couple walking slowly together, speaking with kindness after many years of shared life. They observed strangers helping one another without expecting recognition. These simple moments reminded them that genuine love is built through patience, encouragement, forgiveness, and faithful commitment. They understood that lasting relationships are not sustained by dramatic emotions alone. They are strengthened through countless daily choices to remain kind, honest, and respectful. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story begins unfolding here. Meanwhile, the other person had also reached an important turning point. During the months apart, they had discovered strengths they never realized they possessed. They learned to value their own peace, to appreciate healthy friendships, and to build a life rooted in gratitude rather than uncertainty. Instead of waiting for someone else to complete them, they became someone who could bring encouragement wherever they went. They understood that healthy love grows strongest when two people meet as individuals who have already learned the importance of self-respect, compassion, and personal growth. As evening approached, the person who had carried silent emotions for so long found themselves returning to the place where many of their deepest reflections had begun. Looking toward the sunset, they realized they were no longer asking, "What if I fail?" Instead, they asked, "What kind of person do I want to be?" The answer came quietly but clearly. They wanted to become someone who spoke honestly, loved generously, forgave sincerely, and treated others with dignity even when life became uncertain. That answer gave them the courage they had been searching for all along. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its most meaningful truths. In this story, what felt like God's voice was the quiet invitation to choose character before comfort, truth before fear, and compassion before pride. The greatest blessing was never simply finding another person. It was becoming someone capable of building relationships founded upon trust, humility, patience, and genuine care. Hearts transformed by those qualities discover peace that circumstances alone can never provide. As another sunrise filled the sky with brilliant light, both hearts welcomed the new day carrying something they had not possessed before: quiet confidence. The fear that once controlled every decision had slowly disappeared. They understood that every difficult season had prepared them for this moment. Every lesson had strengthened them. Every challenge had refined them. Whatever conversation lay ahead would no longer be guided by insecurity but by wisdom gained through perseverance and hope strengthened through faith. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal the conversation that changes both hearts forever. The waiting was coming to an end, not because every obstacle had vanished, but because both people had become ready to choose honesty over hesitation, understanding over assumption, and kindness over fear. And as the morning light stretched across the earth once more, they stepped forward with peaceful hearts, ready to embrace the future with courage, humility, compassion, and enduring hope. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the moment that both hearts had unknowingly been preparing for was finally arriving. Listen carefully, because there are seasons when life teaches every lesson in silence before allowing even a single word to be spoken. The months of waiting had not been empty. Every difficult day had quietly shaped two people into wiser, kinder, and more patient versions of themselves. They no longer desired a relationship built on uncertainty or fear. They desired one built upon honesty, mutual respect, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep growing together through every season life might bring. The morning began with unusual peace. The sky was painted with gentle shades of gold and blue, and the first rays of sunlight stretched across the earth as though welcoming a brand new chapter. The one who had once hidden behind silence no longer felt trapped by old fears. Instead, they carried a quiet confidence that had been formed through months of reflection. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance not as a guarantee that everything would unfold exactly as they hoped, but as the gentle encouragement to choose truth even when the future remained uncertain. They realized that courage is not knowing how every conversation will end. Courage is deciding that living honestly is better than living with endless regret. As they walked through the day, familiar places reminded them of how much they had changed. The small cafe where they once shared meaningful conversations no longer filled them with sadness. Instead, it reminded them that beautiful memories can be treasured without becoming chains that hold us in the past. The quiet park where they once reflected during lonely evenings now became a place of gratitude. Every step reminded them that healing does not erase the past. It transforms the way we carry it. They smiled, recognizing that every painful season had quietly become part of the wisdom they now carried into the future. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story unfolds here. Meanwhile, the other person was experiencing a similar awakening. They had stopped wondering whether they were enough and had begun recognizing their own worth. They invested time in strengthening their character, caring for the people around them, and creating a life filled with purpose regardless of what tomorrow might bring. They understood that genuine love never asks someone to abandon their peace. Instead, it invites both people to bring their healthiest selves into the relationship. That realization became one of the greatest gifts they had received during the long season of silence. As evening approached, the long-awaited conversation finally began. It was not filled with dramatic declarations or impossible promises. Instead, it unfolded slowly, with patience and respect. They spoke honestly about their fears, acknowledged the mistakes they had made, and thanked one another for the lessons they had learned during their time apart. There were moments of quiet reflection, moments of gentle laughter, and moments when neither person needed to say anything because understanding had already filled the silence. They realized that some conversations heal not because every answer is found, but because both hearts choose to listen with compassion instead of defending themselves with pride. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its most meaningful truths. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was the invitation to become people who choose grace before judgment, patience before impatience, and honesty before fear. The greatest miracle was not that two people spoke again. The greatest miracle was that they had become the kind of people who could speak with kindness, forgive with sincerity, and respect one another regardless of the path ahead. Hearts transformed by humility always create room for healing. When the conversation came to an end, neither person rushed to define the future. They understood that trust is rebuilt through consistent actions, not hurried promises. They agreed to move forward one step at a time, allowing honesty, mutual respect, and compassion to guide every decision. For the first time in a very long while, there was no pressure to force an outcome. There was only peace. The peaceful confidence that whatever chapter came next would be built upon a stronger foundation than ever before. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal how two transformed hearts begin building a future shaped by trust instead of fear. The silence had fulfilled its purpose. The lessons had been learned. The first conversation had opened a new door. And as another beautiful sunrise rose across the horizon, both hearts stepped into the new day with gratitude, quiet courage, and the understanding that lasting love grows strongest where truth, patience, compassion, and faith walk together. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the choice that had quietly formed within both hearts was finally beginning to shape their future. Listen carefully, because there comes a moment when fear no longer has enough strength to keep two honest hearts apart. The months of waiting had changed them more than they realized. Every disappointment had taught patience. Every unanswered question had built wisdom. Every lonely evening had revealed the importance of gratitude, humility, and sincere communication. Looking back, they understood that the silence had never been empty. It had become the place where character was refined and where love matured beyond emotion into genuine commitment. As dawn gently covered the earth with warm golden light, the one who had once hidden behind uncertainty stepped outside and took a slow breath. The cool morning air felt different, not because the world had changed overnight, but because their heart had. They no longer woke up wondering whether they should continue pretending that their feelings had disappeared. They already knew the answer. They had spent enough time running from honesty. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance not as a guarantee of a specific outcome but as the quiet invitation to live with integrity, speak with kindness, and trust that truth always carries more peace than fear. Throughout the day, unexpected reminders continued appearing in ordinary moments. A child laughed without worrying about tomorrow. An elderly couple shared a quiet smile while walking hand in hand through a nearby garden. A stranger offered encouragement to someone having a difficult day. Watching these simple acts reminded them that the strongest relationships are built one faithful decision at a time. Love grows through listening when it would be easier to argue, forgiving when pride wants to hold on, and remaining patient while trust is rebuilt. Those ordinary examples inspired them to become someone who brought peace wherever they went. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story unfolds here. Meanwhile, the other person had also reached a remarkable place of peace. They had stopped measuring their worth by whether someone chose them. Instead, they discovered confidence through personal growth, meaningful friendships, family, service, and gratitude. They realized that healthy love is never about completing an incomplete person. It is about two people who have learned to stand with strength and humility, choosing each other freely rather than from fear or loneliness. That understanding changed the way they viewed every relationship in their life. As evening arrived, both hearts found themselves reflecting on the same question: if tomorrow offered one honest conversation, what would I want the other person to know? The answers came gently. They wanted to express gratitude instead of blame. They wanted to apologize where necessary without defending past mistakes. They wanted to acknowledge the growth that had taken place during the silence. Most of all, they wanted the conversation to leave both hearts lighter than before, regardless of what the future might hold. That realization removed the pressure they had carried for so long. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its most meaningful lessons. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not about forcing love to happen according to human expectations. It was about patiently preparing two hearts until they were capable of building something healthier than they had ever known before. True love cannot flourish where fear controls every decision. It grows where honesty replaces avoidance, forgiveness overcomes resentment, humility softens pride, and hope becomes stronger than doubt. Those quiet virtues create foundations that remain strong long after emotions rise and fall. As another sunrise painted the horizon with breathtaking beauty, both people welcomed the new day with peaceful confidence. They no longer viewed the future as something to fear. Instead, They saw it as an opportunity to live differently than before. Every sunrise reminded them to express appreciation while there was still time, to choose compassion before criticism, and to protect meaningful relationships through honesty and consistent acts of kindness. The waiting had prepared them for this very season. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the next chapter of this fictional journey will reveal the moment when two transformed hearts begin rebuilding trust through gentle conversations, patient understanding, and faithful actions. The silence had accomplished its purpose. The lessons had been learned. Fear no longer held the final word. And as the morning light stretched across the earth once again, two hearts stepped forward with quiet courage, grateful for every difficult season that had shaped them into people ready to choose truth, compassion, and enduring hope. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, the first honest conversation became the beginning of something far more meaningful than either heart expected. Listen carefully, because when people spend a long time growing separately, they often discover that the greatest reunion is not simply seeing one another again. It is recognizing how much wisdom, patience, and compassion have been gained through every difficult season. The silence had changed them. The waiting had strengthened them. And now, for the first time in a very long while, they were prepared to build trust instead of assumptions, understanding instead of misunderstanding, and hope instead of fear. The morning arrived quietly, with golden sunlight spilling across the hills and a gentle breeze moving through the trees. They agreed to meet in a peaceful place where conversations could unfold without distraction. As they walked toward one another, neither rushed to speak. There was no need for dramatic words. Their smiles reflected gratitude rather than certainty, humility rather than pride. They both understood that meaningful relationships are not rebuilt in a single moment. They are restored one honest conversation, one sincere apology, and one faithful action at a time. When they finally sat together, they allowed silence to exist without discomfort. This time it was different. It was no longer the silence created by fear. It was the peaceful silence that exists between two people who are willing to listen before speaking. One quietly admitted, "I spent so much time believing I had to protect myself that I forgot how important honesty truly is." The other gently replied, "I also needed this time to grow. If we had tried to solve everything before we learned these lessons, we might have repeated the same mistakes." Those words brought relief instead of sadness. They realized they were no longer trying to return to the past. They were choosing to create something healthier for the future. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional heart of this fictional story unfolds here. They spent hours sharing the experiences that had changed them. They spoke about lonely evenings that taught gratitude, difficult decisions that built resilience, and quiet moments that revealed the importance of faith, kindness, and forgiveness. They laughed about joyful memories they had almost forgotten and expressed appreciation for the ways each had encouraged the other's growth, even from a distance. Instead of focusing on blame, they focused on understanding. Instead of reopening old wounds, they allowed compassion to become the foundation of every conversation. As the afternoon sunlight softened, they made an important promise, not a promise filled with impossible guarantees, but one grounded in daily commitment. They promised to communicate honestly instead of making assumptions. They promised to speak with respect even during disagreements. They promised to celebrate one another's victories and offer encouragement during difficult seasons. Most importantly, they promised never to allow fear to make important decisions again. They understood that trust is strengthened not by perfect words but by consistent actions repeated over time. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now reveals one of its deepest truths. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not about removing every obstacle from their path. It was about teaching them to walk through every obstacle with wisdom, humility, patience, and love. The greatest blessing was not that they had found each other again. It was that they had become people capable of creating a relationship built upon honesty, mutual respect, forgiveness, and faithful commitment. Those qualities endure long after excitement fades and circumstances change. As evening painted the sky with breathtaking shades of gold, crimson, and violet, they stood together watching the sunset in peaceful gratitude. Neither felt the need to rush the future. They understood that healthy relationships grow steadily, like a tree whose roots deepen through every changing season. Every conversation would continue strengthening the trust they were rebuilding. Every act of kindness would remind them why they had chosen this path. Every challenge ahead would become another opportunity to practice the lessons they had learned during the long months apart. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey is drawing near. What once seemed like the end had quietly become a beautiful new beginning. Fear had surrendered to faith. Silence had given way to honest communication. Regret had been replaced by gratitude. And as the first stars appeared in the evening sky, both hearts looked toward tomorrow with peaceful confidence, knowing that the strongest love is not the one that never faces difficulty. It is the one that grows stronger because two people choose truth, compassion, patience, and hope every single day. My beloved child, don't skip this chapter, because in this fictional story, what happened after the conversation proved that real transformation is revealed through actions, not simply through words. Listen carefully, because promises are meaningful only when they are supported by consistent kindness, honest communication, and patient commitment. The long season of silence had ended, but both hearts understood that the true journey was only beginning. They no longer wanted to repeat old habits or allow fear to quietly return. Instead, they chose to build something that could endure every changing season of life. As the first light of another sunrise spread across the horizon, they each began the day with quiet gratitude. They no longer woke wondering whether the other person cared. Instead, they focused on becoming the kind of people who would bring encouragement, peace, and integrity into every relationship. In this fictional story, they understood God's guidance as a daily invitation to live with humility, forgive generously, and love through actions rather than impressive speeches. Every sunrise became a reminder that healthy relationships are built one ordinary day at a time. The weeks that followed were not perfect, yet they were filled with meaningful progress. They learned to ask thoughtful questions instead of making quick assumptions. They listened carefully before responding. When misunderstandings appeared, they chose calm conversations instead of silence. When one person felt uncertain, the other offered reassurance instead of judgment. They discovered that trust grows through many small moments, returning a phone call, keeping a promise, showing up when it matters, and speaking truth with kindness. Those quiet habits became stronger than grand gestures because they reflected genuine character. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because the emotional center of this fictional story unfolds here. One peaceful afternoon, they returned to the same place where months earlier they had each stood alone, believing the story might be over forever. Looking around, they realized how different everything felt. The landscape had not changed, yet their hearts had. They remembered the fear that once kept important words hidden. They remembered the sleepless nights, the uncertainty, and the unanswered questions. But instead of feeling sadness, they felt gratitude. Every difficult chapter had prepared them to appreciate honesty, patience, and compassion in ways they never could have understood before. As they continued walking together, they spoke about the future with quiet hope rather than unrealistic expectations. They understood that every relationship requires continued growth. There would still be moments of disagreement, unexpected challenges, and seasons requiring extra patience. Yet they were no longer afraid of those realities. They had learned that love becomes stronger when people face difficulties together with respect, humility, and a willingness to keep learning from one another. They no longer expected perfection. They simply committed themselves to choosing kindness again and again. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares one of its greatest lessons. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not the promise of a life without hardship. It was the assurance that hearts shaped by faith, honesty, forgiveness, and compassion can walk through hardship without losing hope. Real love is never sustained by excitement alone. It grows through faithful choices made every day. Choosing understanding instead of assumptions, gratitude instead of complaints, service instead of selfishness, and truth instead of fear. As another beautiful evening settled across the horizon, they watched the sky slowly fill with stars. They realized that the greatest gift they had received was not simply another chance to reconnect. The greatest gift was the people they had become through every difficult season. They had learned to value peace more than pride, communication more than silence, forgiveness more than resentment, and character more than appearances. Those lessons would remain with them no matter what tomorrow might bring. My beloved child, don't skip these closing words, because the final chapter of this fictional journey is now very close. The long road of waiting had finally led to a place of peace. Every lesson had found its purpose. Every tear had strengthened compassion. Every sunrise had renewed hope. And as they walked beneath the golden light of another new day, they understood that the most beautiful relationships are not built by chance. They are built by two hearts that continue choosing faith, honesty, patience, and love, one faithful step, one sincere conversation, and one ordinary day at a time. My beloved child, don't skip these final words, because every chapter of this fictional story has been leading to this moment. Listen carefully, because the greatest victory was never simply that two hearts found their way back to one another. The greatest victory was that they became people who had learned to love with wisdom instead of fear, patience instead of urgency, and compassion instead of pride. The long season of silence had not been meaningless. It had become the place where both hearts discovered that genuine love begins with honesty, grows through trust, and endures through faithful daily choices. As the first light of a beautiful morning stretched across the horizon, they stood together watching the sunrise in peaceful silence. This silence felt completely different from the one they had known before. It was no longer filled with unanswered questions or hidden emotions. It was filled with gratitude. Every ray of sunlight reminded them that every new day is another opportunity to choose kindness, to speak truth with gentleness, and to appreciate the people who walk beside us. They smiled, realizing that the future no longer frightened them because they had learned to face it together with humility and hope. Looking back, they remembered every difficult chapter that had shaped their journey. They remembered the lonely nights when they questioned everything, the days when fear seemed louder than faith, and the moments when giving up appeared easier than continuing. Yet they also remembered every lesson those seasons had taught. Waiting had developed patience. Forgiveness had brought freedom. Honest conversations had rebuilt trust. Quiet acts of kindness had healed wounds that words alone never could. What once felt like obstacles had become stepping stones leading them toward greater maturity and deeper compassion. My beloved child, don't skip this part, because it contains the heart of this fictional story. In this story, what they experienced as God's guidance was not a promise that life would always be easy or that every dream would unfold exactly as imagined. Instead, it was the gentle invitation to become people whose lives reflected integrity, humility, generosity, and enduring hope. They discovered that the greatest blessings often arrive after hearts have been transformed, not merely after circumstances have changed. Love became stronger because both people had learned to listen carefully, forgive sincerely, encourage faithfully, and choose one another freely rather than out of fear or loneliness. As the weeks turned into months, they continued proving their commitment through everyday actions. They celebrated each other's successes without jealousy. They supported one another during difficult seasons without complaint. When misunderstandings appeared, they chose calm conversations instead of silence. When mistakes were made, they apologized quickly and forgave generously. Slowly, the trust they had rebuilt became stronger than it had ever been before, not because either person was perfect, but because both remained committed to growing together with grace and respect. Listen carefully, my beloved child, because this fictional story now shares its final lesson. Lasting love is never sustained by dramatic moments alone. It is built through countless ordinary decisions made with extraordinary faithfulness. It is choosing patience when frustration appears, compassion when someone is struggling, gratitude when life feels ordinary, and honesty even when the truth is difficult to speak. Those quiet choices shape relationships that remain strong through changing seasons. One peaceful evening, they returned to the same place where months earlier they had believed the story was ending. Standing beneath a sky filled with brilliant stars, they smiled as they remembered how far they had come. The place that once witnessed tears and uncertainty now witnessed laughter, peace, and hope. They quietly thanked God in this fictional story for every lesson learned, every challenge overcome, and every opportunity to become better human beings. They understood that nothing had been wasted. Every difficult chapter had prepared them to treasure the life they were now building together. My beloved child, remember these closing words as this fictional journey comes to an end. Never allow fear to silence kindness. Never let pride prevent forgiveness. Never postpone words of gratitude until tomorrow. Continue choosing truth, humility, patience, and compassion every single day. Those are the foundations upon which meaningful relationships are built, and they are the qualities that bring lasting peace regardless of what tomorrow holds. And so, as another magnificent sunrise illuminated the earth with warm golden light, they stepped forward into a new season of life with grateful hearts. The silence had become understanding. The waiting had become wisdom. The uncertainty had become quiet confidence. They walked hand in hand toward the future, not because they knew every answer, but because they had learned to face every question together with honesty, courage, and hope. Their story ended with hearts transformed, lives renewed, and a future shaped by faith, compassion, and enduring love. And with every new sunrise that followed, they remembered that the greatest gift was never simply finding one another again, it was becoming the kind of people who could bring light, peace, and love wherever their journey continued.